with that, I'd like to introduce to you, how many of you know Sarah Fowler? Yeah, that's a pretty good number. Sarah Fowler ran for state school board from the 7th District 2 years ago at the ripe old age of 23. And you know what? She didn't have any experience. She didn't have any experience with, things like raising taxes and expanding government and things like that. So, but she has been an outstanding representative for us in Columbus at the state school board. The thing that I particularly like is the fact that we don't have to call Sarah and beg for her to do the right thing. She's telling us what the right thing is and asking for our support. That doesn't happen very often. So with that, I'd like to invite Sarah Fowler to come and speak to us.
Thank you. Sorry, I need my notes because I think I aged about 40 years after getting elected, and I have memory loss now. That's not meant as an offense to anyone who... I'm going to stop while I'm ahead. Okay, I am Sarah Fowler. Thank you all for coming, and I'm really happy to be here to talk with you tonight. I was actually thinking this morning on my way up from Akron, I was touring a school there, and I was thinking about this question about, someone asked me, well, what do you think about when you're voting? Like, how do you decide what you're voting for? And I said, well, I guess I have a rubric in my mind, and it's kind of based on what I ran on, kind of that parents have the right and responsibility to direct the education of their children. So I want to know, is this policy helpful to parents? And I believe in local control. So does this help or hinder a local school district's ability to make its decisions? And so I was thinking about that, and I thought, oh, and the icing on the cake is, I would like to represent you in the way I want to be represented. And you say, oh, that sounds nice. I say, no, I have experience in how I wanted to be represented. And by that I mean, I was bound and determined that I was going to hold accountable certain ones of our elected officials in the kind of the rising swing of that in 2008, 9, 10. And so I laid out what I thought a responsible elected official should do. And now I'm trying to hold myself to the same standard that I held other people to, and finding that it's a very difficult task sometimes. So along that line, one of my goals, or gripes, whichever way you'd like to look at it, was to have a monthly newsletter, because I don't like feeling disconnected from what's going on, and I like to know, all right, so what did you vote on? You said you had 4 meetings this month, and we didn't hear anything about them. So I have been putting together a monthly newsletter, and there's a sign-up sheet back with Nikki on the table if you're not getting it. It's via email, and I think I've only had to combine one issue so far. As we get into campaigning, we may have more, sadly. But my goal is to send you a monthly newsletter letting you know what's going on. Along those lines, I need to give you my radio disclaimer, and that is that I'm not here to speak on behalf of the State Board of Education. I don't represent their views publicly, and so I'm here to represent myself. And if you have questions, I'd be happy to talk with you about that later. It's interesting, Chuck, that you would say I had no experience. True, I had no experience being elected, but I did have a little bit of campaign experience with the Healthcare Freedom Amendment before getting elected. I was the county co-coordinator for Ashtabula County, and I found that very helpful, both in running the campaign and in connections, and I've met a lot of interesting people now that I'm working on some of these projects on the state board that I knew from my former life, if you will. And it's been really encouraging to see how connections that were formed during that time have been beneficial after getting elected. I just wanted to give a slight overview of what the State Board of Education does. You may know that it's a 19-member board. There are 11 elected members. We each represent roughly 1 million people. I have parts of 6 counties in my district, 4 whole counties and 2 part counties. And that's actually a fairly average size for the districts, maybe even on the smallish side. The largest district has some 26 counties, and so I'm really glad to have this area of the state to represent, other than the fact that I like everyone who lives here. 82 miles to the southwest corner and 42 to the northeast from my house is far enough without adding more counties. So basically, our job, if you will, is to create policy around the laws that the legislature establishes. Our constitutional responsibility is to appoint the state superintendent. And we had the opportunity to do that last March, I believe it was, after I joined the board. And I know this is old news, but just to touch on it briefly, that was a very defining vote for me, because up to that point I was kind of getting my feet wet and finding out what was going on. And then we had this major vote. And I say major because we were presented with 2 candidates that I felt were inadequate for the job. Not because they were not nice people, they both are. They were both very nice people. And I'm not saying this to say I have anything against them, but we had, at present, but for this job description, we're putting a superintendent over the top of all of the teachers in the state. And we had one man who had embezzled money from his local district as a state superintendent, and we had one man who had a DUI. And we authorized the punishment for teachers and administrators who have these kind of failings in their professional life. So I didn't feel like it was holding up the same standard, and I said, I want to vote no on both. And they said, well, that's not an option. I said, you said we were going to vote up and down. Well, the vote got changed, so what we had to do, I had to abstain from that vote and enter into the public record that that was a no vote for both. And the reason I bring it up is because that was a very difficult vote to make. There was a lot of pressure from both sides to support their candidate. And pretty much everybody knew who the candidate was going to be ahead of time. And there was also knowledge that if certain people didn't show up, that person wouldn't get elected, or appointed. So there was a lot of pressure going into it. But now that I've been on the board for 17 months, I can look back and say, wow, I really needed that vote to help me to have the courage to keep voting no all summer long, because everything else after that was easy. It really was. I say that seriously though, because that was probably the hardest vote out of last year. And I voted no on a lot of policies going through the summer because even though the legislature had created it in law and said, thou must do this, create this within X number of days. When I joined the board in January, there were over 90 mandates from one piece of legislation to be accomplished primarily before July and definitely before the end of the year last year. 90. We were so busy last year. It was just amazing. So this year, we've gotten around to every board meeting. I'm opening up and I'm going, okay. Oh, there's not a whole lot of new items. Okay, not a whole lot of new items. I said to our board president this month, I said, the agenda sure looks different when we don't have 90 mandates to pass in 1 year, doesn't it? And amazingly, it does. And so I'm really glad that this year, we've been back to more 5-year reviews.